Hello, everyone. Ben here with the University of Minnesota Extension Center for Community Vitality. It is certainly my pleasure to be here before you today. Thank you to Dr. King and really everyone at the Rural Renewal Research Renewal Initiative and Oklahoma State to even offer a program like this. This really helps us build a positive narrative around our rural communities that is desperately needed. So I appreciate the recognition, I appreciate the support, and I truly appreciate the opportunities that you present for others to tell their story as well. I'm going to be presenting my key work here, which is rewriting the rural narrative. I grew up wanting to live in a rural community, and I went to school at the University of Minnesota Morris, which is a town of about 5,000 during my undergraduate work. And I wanted to stay there. I thought that was a small town. It was very nice, easy to get things done. And Roger McCannon was the head of continuing education at the time, and he hired me on as the first employee at the Center for Small Towns. And it was during this time I started to get my feet wet doing rural work and really wanting to stay in our rural communities and help and be of service to our rural communities as well. So I'm going to take you through a little bit of a journey of where I've been and really look at some of the applied research I've done that's been a response to the small towns that have really honestly wanted more from our research experts across the state. So I'm going to get on sharing my presentation here. Give me one moment. So you see the title is Rewriting the Rural Narrative, and really the premise behind all my life's work has been that the narrative we use to describe our small towns is terrible. It's really not good. You would think we're all dying, that there's nobody left and only the lucky few escape, right? But really I bring data. My undergraduate work was in math and statistics, and I really like to use data to help paint a story about where we are. And a lot of times I found that the stories we're telling about our rural communities were based upon historical facts and not really modern day equivalents of what is vital today. So with that, we'll jump right in. I think there has been a lot of renewed interest in our small towns and rural places because of the pandemic. And so we see headlines like the Heartlands Revival, Americans are big on the idea of living in the country. And I just want to remind everybody that this is not new. I think there's been a renewed interest right now in a majority of people looking at this, but those of us in the field know that our rural communities have survived, and we'll talk a little bit about this. And I'll just say this, that if all of our small towns were dying before the pandemic and the pandemic was going to save us, then why couldn't I find a house to buy before the pandemic? And during the pandemic, it only exacerbated some of these trends. So this really kind of goes through a story of a narrative that I went through in my own history. So I started doing this rural development work in undergraduate in the late 90s, and I started to read books, write and articles, and you start to see headlines and books being written about rural America from a negative perspective. And yes, we do have problems. I think American society has a number of problems. Whether or not they're solvable is another question. But really, when we look at how this narrative is being painted about rural, it's a lot of times not being written by us, but being written about us. So we see a number of books and articles like this, like literally a headline from breadbasket to basket case. You could not have written a more demeaning headline if you tried. If you're a mental health professional, we should be taking umbrage at some of these characterizations of our rural communities. And a lot of times this leads right into additional stereotypes that then get painted. So there is a narrative out there. It's very common that there's a brain drain, and that's when our high school kids, graduate and they leave. And apparently that's a big problem when that's not new. This has been a historical trend that kids want to get out. I mean, what are you going to do? Tell your kids they got to stay? Rather, I would let them know that they have a more than viable place to come back to, and we'll talk about some of that. We really, there's a narrative that we live in the middle of nowhere, or that we're a sleepy town that was woken up by the blank, and fill in the event that woke the town up at that point. You've also got these characterizations that everybody knows one another when you really don't. Nobody locks their doors when you do, right? And a lot of times this narrative is based upon what we had, what we don't have, what we wish you had, or what we could have had. And really, we should be looking at what we have. Rather than through the lens of what we had, we'll look at what we have and where we want to go. So I'm going to introduce a term to you called anecdata. And anecdata is information which is presented as if it's based on serious research, but in fact it's based on what somebody thinks is true. you'll notice anecdote is in there. And for me, as a data guy, the plural of anecdote is not trend. You have three people sitting around a table talking about how terrible your town is. That's not a trend. That's three people. So we have to be very careful about these characterizations of our rural communities based upon some of these stereotypes and just ideas that we have based upon our visuals or based upon our historical memories of what we expect to find there. And that's not to say we haven't went through dramatic change in our rural communities. The mechanization of agriculture alone in the early 1900s reduced the number of farm workers by 20 to 60% in some places. We saw a migration of people to those urban areas. Roads and transportation systems were introduced just 100 years ago, and this transformed community life where we essentially went from horse and buggy to not horse and buggy in about 15 years. And this was dramatically transformative to our rural communities, as no longer was a single town kind of the one-stop shop. Now people lived in this bigger region where I could get to Mankato in an hour as opposed to a day-long trip. So we kind of look at these perspectives of how rural has changed through this historical lens of agriculture and our transportation networks in the early 1900s. And then the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s start to roll around. We are going through globalization, and we transformed our main streets. And it's a really kind economist way of saying business is closed. When we say Main Street restructured, right, we lose in hardware stores, grocery stores, apothecaries, right? And a lot of times it's, just one more nail in the coffin. We lose our grocery store, a small town's going to die. If we lose our school, which is the next one, the 80s and 90s, many of you probably remember, we consolidated a lot of school districts at that time. And you would read headlines and proclamations at the time that says one more nail in the coffin. And now, why would anybody want to stay here at this time? I'll remind you that the probably most resilient population in our rural communities at that time were our kids. They didn't care if they lost the owl name and now they're the Windhawks or whatever they named their name to. The kids were actually quite resilient in this. I think the adults had a bigger problem with some of these changes. And not to say there aren't negative effects from this, but a lot of these things are so transformative, it impacts what we see every day. So now we see an empty building. We see where the bank used to be. We see where the hardware store used to be. But I want to remind you that these trends of closing a hardware store or grocery store are not a distinctly rural trend. Well, this is called globalization. We are living in a global world, and all of these trends impact all places generally the same. And what differentiates one town from another in successfully responding to those is what we call social capital. So with that, we do have a lot of things that kind of dictate and demand our attention in terms of the historical narrative here. And this is where our historical narrative lies, is in these trends and in these components and compositions of our small towns from the past. But, I like the Mark Twain quote here, rumors of my death have been greatly exaggerated. Like, show me all the dead towns. If we've got all these dead towns, where are they, right? So for me, small towns are really microcosms of globalization. And we want to understand how the world is changing. We can look to small towns. This isn't 1940, where trends from Italy take months to get to the United States, and then it took another month to get to our rural communities, right? I mean, we are an instantaneous society today. So we are able to witness some of these changes in our small towns well before we may recognize or realize what they look like in our more urban environments. But I want to remind you all that we have survived. We have made it this far. Rural is changing. We have constantly been changing. And you all, as community leaders, have been helping renew our communities all along. And I don't think we get enough credit for this. I think many of you should be patting yourself on the back for still being here. And even more so, still being a choice of destination for people today. So some data behind the rural trends. Rural population overall in the US has not gone down. It's gone up by 11% since 1970. It went down a very small percentage from 2010 to 2020. And I think I have a good reason for that. And we'll look at some of that later on. But really what's gone down is a relative percentage of Americans that live in small towns and rural places. So in 1970, about 1 in 4 people lived in a small town or a rural place. But by 2020 today, it's down to 14%. And this has a very large impact on politics, right, in terms of representation, but that's about it. So really what I'm seeing here, and a lot of times it gets painted in this way, that this is a preference for rural living, or for urban living. More people want to live in urban environments. Well, actually the rural population went up. It just didn't go up as fast as the urban population. So this is where it looks like rural is declining because of that relative percentage, when in fact it's growing, but just not as fast as urban areas. At the same time, many of our urban areas get reclassified. They were rural at 30 years ago, and now they have become urbanized. Many of our urban areas have not grown taller, they've grown wider. And you see this, these orange counties across the country that surround, especially those that surround our urban places, have become urbanized because initially people moved out to them because they weren't urban, which should raise some flags, right? Hey, there's an interest in rural or less dense living. So much so that so many people moved out, they become urbanized. And then what happens is those counties become reclassified from rural status to urban status. And now all of a sudden, my rural data looks like we lost people, when in fact, you just moved those people over to the urban category. 25% of all counties in the US have been reclassified from rural to urban since 1974. You're welcome, urbanity. You have taken millions of people away from our population. Not taken, right? But really, this is a destination, and I don't think we realize what this trend actually means. So I'm going to do one thing here, which is talk about total population. I haven't updated this map for 2020, but we tend to still have this proclamation that we need our population to grow, right? And if a lot of times people love these maps, the new data comes out, people are like, hey, get our total population maps. Well, here they are. And ultimately, they're looking for the counties that grow in population. And these are the gradations of orange and red here, is that those are the counties that grew. And then obviously the connotation here is that if your population did not go up, you're a loser, right? So ultimately, look across the whole Midwest here, we got a bunch of loser counties are losing population. Do not become too infatuated with this total population. In fact, we have found in this region, Western Minnesota here in 5-county region, since 1960, their population went down by 35%, which is part of the narrative, right? People don't want to live in rural places anymore. They're all moving away, apparently. But when you look at the number of households went up. And how can that be, right? The average household size in 1940 was 3.6, and that's dropped to 2.6 in 2018. You are going to lose 29% of your population. So really, imagine like it used to be 2.6 kids in the households. You have 2 adults generally, and then the 2.6 kids, where now it's 1.6 kids, or whatever that number looks like in terms of family households. This is just average household size. So honestly, you are going to lose 29% of your population with you doing nothing but existing in the modern world. This is demographic destiny, that you are going to lose 29% of your population. At the same time, what happens between 2 time periods when 2 kids leave the household and move out to a different area, right? Your population just went down by 2, but your households stayed the same. Today, we have a much more common scenario where you have 2 senior members in the household, and one of them passes away. And the surviving spouse ultimately stays in that home. So what happens now? Your population just went down by 1, but your occupied households are still the same. Do not become too infatuated with total population. So just as an example, the narrative is around the population change. But if you look at housing changes in these counties, they're actually stable or they go up. And really 59% of all in Minnesota, 59% of all the counties that lost population gained housing units. And same, here's Montana, another number of counties. The narrative is fairly negative in some of these counties, but you look at the occupied housing unit change and they go up. So I think we have to be careful about how we interpret these total population numbers. So for me, households or houses actually become our key unit of analysis, because total population doesn't tell us anything about who's coming and going, and tells us very little bit about how things are changing. So we shift the unit of analysis to the household. And really, what are we measuring? Growth or decline? A lot of times, if your population stays the same, you're seen as stagnant. Again, this narrative matters. The words we use matter. Our small towns, we don't just build new houses because you want them. It costs money. Generally, our housing stocks are a finite number, and they are the key for the future of our small towns. And even within a stable population base, there's change. There is always change. There are always people moving in and always people moving out. In fact, over 45% of US households move every 5 years. So there's kind of this myth here that only the lucky few escape rural America, and whoever's left is, just left to, close up the town, right? But really, we have had people moving in. And this was kind of the first glimpse I looked at here was, a lot of people talk about the brain drain. When you look at the difference in population and this was the very first chart I ever made in my career of trying to understand this trend, is yes, in this 10-year time period, if the bar goes to the left, you lose these people. If the bar goes to the right, you gain these people. There's entire books, there's stacks of journal articles on the brain drain. And I was looking here and seeing, wow, there's growth in the 30, 40s, and 50-year-olds and 10 to 14-year-olds, and they're not not moving alone, they're coming with their parents there. And I really wanted to know what was going on here, and the number of citations was minimal. It really confused me. But ultimately, looking at some of these positive trends is not incentivized in the rural development industry. So I wanted to document this a little bit more clearly. And we wanted to call this the rural brain game, because if you're moving in your 30s, 40s, and 50s, you're in your prime earning years, right? Some of them are bringing children. We wanted to better understand what was going on. So we connected with Nebraska. We did studies here in Minnesota looking at who's moving in, and we surveyed them, right? As good researchers, we did surveys. And we found out that newcomers move for, simpler pace of life was overwhelmingly number one. Safety and security, number two, especially high with people with children. And the third reason was the low cost of housing. Now, we also look at some of the characteristics of who are these people. One of the things that really kind of turned our thinking on its head is the very first one here. We had a question there. Did you move because you had a job or a job offer? Just 1/3 of rural workforce movers are moving for a job, meaning 2/3, we find out, are not moving for a job. They're moving for quality of life, recreation, like being in a slower pace of life, like all of these things. Quality of life is really the trump card here. At the same time, just 1 in 4 of rural movers have lived in that community before. Like if you lived in the community before, you have access to social networks, and if your plumbing bursts at 1 a.m., you can call somebody. But 3/4 of new people moving into our rural communities are not from there. What kind of experience do they have? How do they tap into the local networks? Do they even get welcomed into town? These are more than viable questions as we move forward. Now, there's more characteristics here I want to talk about. I mean, the telecommute one, 14% of these newcomer households were telecommuting, and this is pre-pandemic. So this was 2019 when we did this study. Right now, Montana just got done replicating our study across every county in the state, and are finding very similar results there as well. Nebraska results were also very similar to these. So what we're finding is these people are generally new to the community. Not all of them are bringing their children with them, and they've got a variety of jobs they may actually be bringing with them. They are not always taking on jobs in the community. So we are going to make sure to get this PowerPoint presented or offered to you after the event, so you can look at this with more detail. When we look at some of these preferences, why people move, it makes a lot of sense. Some people live closer to relatives, and like Randy Cantrell, who's now retired for the University of Nebraska, said, some people want to live closer to relatives, but not too close, right? So, I mean, there's a lot of nuance to some of this as well. It's very interesting, very fascinating to look at some of these characteristics. At the same time, when I would present this information early on, I would get local leaders say, well, if there's all these new people here, where are they? They're not part of my groups. And I say, you're right. They're not part of your groups. They're part of theirs. And you're not part of their groups. So we need to be careful about how we talk about one another, because many times these younger people do not feel an affinity to some of these historical community-based groups. So I think there is a premise out there, and I'm trying to counter this, that social life is dying. That nobody wants to be involved anymore. But yet when we look at the National Center for Charitable Statistics data, which uses the IRS data and some Census Bureau data, we actually see that the number of nonprofits has gone up by 10 to 15% every 5 years. Social life is not dying, it just looks different. This is a constant change. We look across the state or across the country of the nonprofit change from 2000 to 2010. We see some places that experience loss, and we think we have some reasons for this. I'm really not going to get into the depth of this research, other than to say, for those of you that are saying, what about 2010 to 2020? Well, there was a shift where the IRS kind of cleaned up their database and really took out all of these dead nonprofits. But once you remove those nonprofits, you still see this growth. However, when you look at the change from 2010 to 2020, you've got a large loss in there, which is an artifact that ultimately impacts your growth and losses. So there are still gains, but the biggest shift I want to explain here is a shift in how people want to be involved. Historically, people would be involved in a narrow geography with a broad focus. For example, the Hancock Community Betterment Club. It only helped Hancock, right? The narrow geography, but it had a broad focus. It helped build a school, playground. It helped, donate to the church or whatever. So today, people want to be involved in just the opposite. As opposed to a narrow geography, it's a broad geography. And as opposed to a broad focus for the group, it's a narrow focus. The West Central Minnesota Bicycle Association. It's 12 counties big, but really their actions are geared around the interest area, but they still have impacts. We find out that these people end up spending more money. They donate more, they lead more. It's actually very interesting, the nuances around this engagement. So we have actually in the community development industry have some work to do to connect some of these groups to one another. And when you look at the types of groups that have been created over the years, animal related is not the Eagles and the Lions Club. that is like those Eagle and Lions is under mutual membership benefit, like one of the only categories to decline. Animal related are things like rescue groups and shelters for animals. But we've also had great increases in environment, recreation, youth organizations. So I think what we have to look at, rather through the lens of historical organizations, look at where are the groups being created. That is where there is traction. And then our job again as community developers is to try to connect those two. At the same time, these newcomers have been moving in and, involved socially, they're diversifying the economy. And I think there's a premise out there that, if you want to move to a rural area, you've got to be engaged in agriculture. And we really know that our economy is actually very diverse. While it may not be diverse in any one place, when you start to put down regions, when you start to look at the totality of the rural economy, we have the same diversity. This is a study done out of the University of Minnesota here. Our extension staff, Bridget Tuck, we really show that, you've got a higher number in agriculture, which makes sense. But in all the other industries, we have approximately the same distribution of jobs. So we have to be very careful about how we describe what we can do in our rural communities. So really fill in the blank. You can be a blank in rural America. Fill in the blank. And while it may not exist in my town, it may exist in the town or the county neighboring mine. So we have to be careful about using our my first approach, my city first approach in trying to talk to people about what they want to do or where they want to move. And this makes even more sense because we know there's a tool called On the Map, which tells you how many people every day, and you can do this at the county or the city level, how many people commute out every day. This is Pine County, Minnesota, 7,200 people commute out every day, 3,200 people commute in every day, and 5,100 people both live and work inside the county boundaries. Now, I just want to remind you that our county boundaries were drawn during a time of horse and buggy. They do not reflect how people actually live. So when we look at this scenario, right, we have found across Minnesota, just 49% of people work in the county that they live in. So we have effectively decoupled residents from work. So historical industrial recruitment assumes that we're going to be bringing in people to live in our town and work in our town. We have to be very careful about this because we have plenty of people moving in as a resident in these communities and they don't need the local jobs. And what does that really mean in terms of our local economy? So I think getting back to where do you live? I don't know, in the middle of nowhere because you've never heard of my town, right? So really, we have to be very careful what that means. Really, don't we actually live in the middle of everywhere? We may live in one place, work in another. We recreate in this entire huge region. So there is, and we do know that there is a preference for rural living. And the Pew Research Institute has done this study repeatedly over the years. And while 20% of the population, it's down to 14% now, live in small towns or rural places, 51% of people would prefer to. There is actually a demand for rural and small town living. And I would argue that many of these people do not think they ever could because the narrative is so terrible describing our small towns and the opportunities that we have. Again, if we have a narrative based upon our past, we are not inviting anybody in for our future. So with that, I would like you all to prepare for one of the largest demographic changes that's going to happen to rural America, really since the mechanization of ag in 1930 and some of the major depopulation that had it then. This I don't expect to be depopulation. It is constant change. And what is that? Today, 30% of rural homeowners are over the age of 70. Imagine this, a third of your homes are going to turn over in the next 10 years. In fact, many of those people over the age of 70 today are staying in their homes. And this actually inhibits the ability for us to bring new people in because our seniors who normally after the age of 62 had started moving out of home ownership have stayed in home ownership. This generation is unique in that. So in a sense, many of our rural populations are remaining stable or dropping in population because a large percentage are seniors and they're losing their spouses. So trickle, 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 right? You lose one spouse, trickle down one, lose another spouse, trickle down one. So these seniors are not moving necessarily out. A lot of times we don't have anywhere for them to move over to. And this is honestly a whole nother presentation I've got on moving in, moving out, and moving over. But put together, when we look at the composition of the age of homeowners in our rural communities, now, not just our 30% over the age of 70, but 75% are baby boomers and older. 3/4 of our homes are going to turn over in the next 20 years. Are we ready for this? So for me, housing is the point at which our community changes. And without housing, there is nowhere for future wealth to live. So one of the questions that we asked in our rural workforce mover study was this, like, did you believe the community is welcoming? And overwhelmingly, a lot of people did think the community is welcoming. But when we cross-tab this by, another question which we had, which is, are you likely to live here in 5 years? And this really gets at the point, like, how is your experience going, right? And if the people believe the community was welcoming, they strongly agree that the community is welcoming. 86% of people say they're going to be here in 5 years. But if people do not believe the community is welcoming, now you've got a retention issue. This isn't just a resident retention issue. This could potentially be an employment retention issue. So ask your employers how hard it is to keep people at times. And they're only going to incur more recruitment costs if you do, and retention costs if you do recruitment wrong. So if you do not have a welcoming experience in your community, how are people going to find your place? Are you ready to take a hit on the equity of your home because you have a negative narrative in your community and you don't have any way to welcome newcomers in? I think this is something we need to work on. So we have built a model here in Minnesota called resident recruitment. It's really it complements traditional industrial recruitment, which is trying to bring a business, and then that business will allow jobs to happen. We are saying that residents themselves come in. And in order for us to have a successful resident recruitment program, we need to engage community developers, economic developers, and our tourist agencies. So we really do live in the middle of everywhere. But how do we make local decisions, right? You've got city council, county commissioners that are trying to make decisions in jurisdictions that don't reflect modern life. People live in one place, work in another, shop in others, play in others, right? Eat out all across these regions that we have. And actually, we have a middle of everywhere exercise. If you saw that earlier, I believe we had a breakout that was offered this morning. So I would say this to the mayor, like, all right, Miss Mayor, if I tell you I'm going to be moving to I'm potentially looking at your community, how do you respond to that? And then the mayor's going to be like, oh, you're going to love this town. We have this and this and this, right? You're always trying to show off your town. But then I say, well, I'm looking at moving to this other town that's 15 miles down the road. And if your response is then parochial, which is to say, you don't want to move there. They've got nothing going on. It's all about here, right? Now, what did you just do? Not only did you downplay, that other town, you downplayed yourself because you really are in the middle of nowhere. If you cannot talk positively about our rural communities and our regions that we live in, we're doing a disservice to us all. So people are making a choice. These newcomers are creating groups, they're building their community, they've been diversifying the economy, buying and starting businesses. We didn't even talk about business succession and the successes we've seen there. People live in a region, and there's certainly more than warm bodies. So the bottom line is people want to live and move to your towns for what you are today and will be tomorrow, not what may have been. In all the years of study I've been doing on this topic of newcomers moving in, whenever we ask people why they move in, nobody ever says they're moving to your town for pity. Nobody ever says, I'm going to move in to help you out, Hancock, because I know you lost your grocery store 23 years ago and I just want to help you out, right? Nobody ever says that. People are moving into our communities for what they see today. And if we cannot try to see through the eyes of these newcomers and see the joy and the love that they are bringing to these small towns, we are not going to provide a paved way for the future of our community. So with that, I really just want to thank you for this prize, the recognition, the support. I mean, really to all those in the rural development industry have supported me over the years. Dr. Engen Sunger, professor of statistics at the University of Minnesota Morris, first got me involved doing rural development work. Roger McCannon gave me the first chance as a job at the Center for Small Towns. Randy Cantrell, can't thank you enough over the years, been a real kindred heart, talking about rural development and rural communities, and really the primacy, the action for us is at the level of community, and I have always loved that. But overall, the University of Minnesota Extension System for even having a platform to do this kind of research, and really all the small towns who keep demanding more from me. You've all heard this. What do you want to hear next? But the number one group I want to thank is my family, my wife, Tara, my kids, Calvin and Truman. They've been here every day as I travel around, right? We travel a lot in Extension. We know our cars very well. But without the family here to support us, I don't know where I'd be in this life. I think it's been a real pleasure to do this work and to be received in this way. And just, it's been real humbling to have this kind of recognition. So with that, if you have any questions, please feel free to email me at any time. I'm interested in helping anyone and everyone improve the narrative of their rural communities. Thank you for your time.